Welcome to Chapter 5, all about sound media. We will talk about companies that dominate the field and the impact of technology on the music industry and the audio industry, including file sharing, the systems within the industry that produce music on a massive scale, and then we will talk a lot about radio and the transitions that are happening there that are damaging their profitability. The recording industry is a juggernaut. This is a massively huge industry. It brings in over $18 billion a year globally, with all of its related symbiotic industries, which include radio, music, television, fan magazines, concerts, merchandise, sponsorships, and other miscellaneous music-related enterprises. They all rake in another $17 billion a year. People love music, and companies cater to that demand through many different ways. There are large corporate mills that produce certain genres on demand and sign bands that could generate profits. And then there's indie labels which pump out more grassroots sound that is profitable. Right now, also with the easily used and accessible music creation softwares and equipment, individuals can distribute their own music without a contract. So there's a lot of changes and a lot of ways to make money within the recording industry. The music industry works through a variety of systems. With record labels, you have majors and indies. The majors include the Big Four, among a few others. The Big Four are Sony Bertelsmann, or Sony BMG, EMI, Warner Music, formerly part of Time Warner, and Universal Music. These companies control about 84% of the U.S. market and 75% of the global market. And 15% of U.S. sales goes to indie labels, which is a small piece of a huge, huge pie. So indie labels frequently get absorbed into the Big Four, and the most famous indie label is Motown, which is now part of Universal. And today, much of the indie market is made up of artist-owned enterprises who have the capital to keep the label running and enjoy the freedom of being separate from the Big Four system, artists like Prince, Ani DeFranco. The A&R structure is a term that stands for artist and repertoire, and this system within the industry gives ultimate power over artists for a small sect of the company. They tell the artist what to sing, when, how to dress, and this system creates manufactured bands that are geared towards a certain demographic. The A&R system was a really successful tactic, used a lot in the 1950s, and it's kind of declined in popularity since. The artists in the A&R system were used as workhorses and produced what they were told to when they were told to, with little control over anything. The point was mass market sales, to deliver a popular product. A small number of record executives were creating pop culture, and this resulted in a homogenized sound from coast to coast, with everyone listening to the same types of songs, and the artist was kind of just left to do their job and not express themselves. This system started to become unmanageable for executives in the 1980s because a new wave of low-cost recording and mixing equipment. Individual artists had found new power and could control their art at a relatively high sound quality, and this was the rise of the garage band. Creativity was on the loose, and new independent labels were popping up everywhere, and this gave artists leverage when dealing with record companies. It brought greater diversity to the music scene and new subcategories in music which fragmented audiences. The A&R system didn't work well under this new era of rebellion and freedom from mainstream corporate control. And currently, record companies are kind of in demise, and they're grasping for ways to innovate, and more individuals are able to be successful. While the success comes in smaller sections, so instead of selling 8 million copies, artists might sell 50,000. So they aren't getting rich, but the playing field has leveled and more people can make a living, and more genuine music is created for the love of creating music and not just for money influencing everything. Some would say that music has gotten better as the internet has democratized it, and the money at the top is less part of the equation. Not all technologies have benefited the artists, like recording capabilities. and the unleashing of pent-up creative expression. File sharing gave consumers access to all of this music without having to pay. And in 2000, companies like Napster and Grokster caused this unprecedented drop in CD sales, and they ended up in court. The record stores began closing their doors, and the judicial system diverted their attention from the software companies, away from Napster and Grokster, to the consumers, and started prosecuting them for illegal downloading on the civilian level in order to deter people from stealing music. Quickly, the recording companies tried to tap into this new file sharing market and attempting to turn a profit there. And there were several attempts at a successful business model, but nothing really worked until Steve Jobs launched the iTunes platform, which had no monthly fees. 99-cent downloads were really successful. And along with the rise in popularity of the iPod and other MP3 devices, in the first week, more than 1 million songs were downloaded from iTunes. And the system, it wasn't free like Napster or Grokster, but it was legal, and the recordings took up a smaller amount of space on computers. They had clean, clear sound, and people weren't running the risk of accumulating a virus from downloading like you were on Napster and Grokster. So it was this huge smash hit, along with these micropayments where you didn't have to make a commitment, but you could purchase things at will. So everyone was happy and got their cut, and consumers came to the new service in droves. This same downloading model and micropayments has been used by other online retailers like Amazon and Walmart in order to sell and provide digital content. The recording industry has weathered the changes so far from being centralized and controlled to independent challengers cropping up and new technologies changing the way that we receive our sound media. And some ever-present obstacles throughout all of these changes, and even a catalyst for some of these changes, has been regulatory pressures. And one form of regulatory pressure is the FCC, or the Federal Communications Commission. They control licensing for radio stations and have some say over what's released by record companies in an indirect way. So their power lies in whether or not they value a radio station or a certain music as valuable. And their views get mixed in with the radio company's decisions to play something and inadvertently influence what gets played and said on the air. Labeling of different types of sound media began with the Parents Music Resource Center in the 1980s. The group claimed that song lyrics were having detrimental effects on children, including suicide and pregnancy, parental abuse, drug abuse, among a huge laundry list of social ills. So they took their argument to the FCC and the National Association of Broadcasters, and their concerns resulted in record companies voluntarily labeling music as explicit and such. While many people argue that this change sold more explicit records than it did any good, it was a compromise that was reached by the groups. More could not be done due to our right to freedom of expression. And even though there were extreme cases, in 1989, during the height of the decency in music debate, Two Live Crew released an album called Nasty as They Wanna Be, and this album went double platinum and was the first album in history that was deemed legally obscene and was banned by the Florida courts. The ruling was later overturned, and the controversy added to the album's notoriety and actually boosted its sales. Artistic freedom is the defense used in most cases of attempted censorship, and while record companies take the side of the artist in most cases, they will not fight very hard for free expression and will compromise in order not to lose money or consumers. So in the case of controversy fueling sales, they would probably take a stronger stance. Radio is the avenue that leads to record sales, and this has caused dependence on airplay and other problems like record promoters offering stations bribes and incentives to play their stuff. Radio causes sales to soar, and it's essentially free advertising for music companies. So, this dependence has waned since the invention of the iPod, but companies still see radio as an important link to their target markets. They offer the stations free access to their music and at times re-record songs to suit the target audience. They aim to get airplay that is often and prolonged. Exposure is the key to success in the music industry, and this success is measured in record sales. And record sales are measured with awards like gold records, which is 1 million singles or 500,000 album copies, and platinum records, which is 2 million singles or 1 million record copies sold. And these measures of success are only true if the amount paid to the artist nets a profit that pleases shareholders. So success in sales and success on the bottom line are two very different things. The influence of radio is in part due to its audience size. Even though the regular demographic of 18 to 24-year-olds is declining due to other media sources for music, radio has really stayed competitive with 520 million radios in the United States alone. So that's 2 radios for every 1 person, and the average teen and adult listening 22 hours a week on 13,000 stations. So radio is still netting $16 billion annually in profits and remain a large source of entertainment and news. Radio is ubiquitous, which it's all around us. We hear it in the office, in the store. So the influence and scope of radio is massive, but it is in decline like a lot of other forms of media. The content of radio varies. The station scaled back in the 1950s as much of this type of content made its way to the television. Recorded music took its place as a low-cost time filler that happened to be very successful. Then, in the 1970s, many consumers tuned into the superior sound quality of the FM station. AM became more focused on talk radio, which suited the lower quality audio better. The first all-news channel began in 1961 with Extra in Southern California. It launched the popularity of news shows and listener call-in format that's still used today, and different forms of news radio were born out of this innovation. All news worked on breaking news events as they happened, headline services which focused on headlines and stayed away from lengthy, in-depth news stories, news packages which are carefully produced news stories like we get from NPR. Talk radio gained popularity in the 80s with live listener call-in formats and a sort of interactive radio show. They leaned towards problem solving, politics, and current events, and in some cases, sensationalistic shock jock programs like Howard Stern. Commercial terrestrial radio is the name used to describe traditional radio stations that use transmitters instead of satellites to deliver content. This is the sect of radio transmission that is taking the biggest hit with the advent of new technologies. Terrestrial radio was shaped into its modern form by regulations. Radio is regulated more than print media, and some would say it is regulated in an unconstitutional way. This overreaching government regulation is justified by the way the government has defined the airwaves in order to have more control and kind of sidestep the First Amendment. The Federal Radio Commission began awarding licenses to control the overcrowding of signals in the Wild West days of early radio. And so they set up a system where they could deny licenses based on stations' interest to the public, convenience, and its necessity. So the radio system is viewed in a similar way as our public park system. The government works under a trustee concept, like they are the public steward of radio land. They take care of it for the people, and that is how they get to control the airwaves. Under this trustee concept, based on rules and perimeters for stations, the FCC bestows licenses on stations who are of value to the people. Public radio began as experimental broadcasting used by universities for educational purposes. The stations could acquire non-commercial licensing to broadcast their material, but were barred from airing advertising or turning a profit. So this system was a small test bed that didn't seem to have a lasting model for actually sustaining itself until the influential Carnegie Commission for Educational TV began rethinking the possibilities for this public format. They championed the cause of public broadcasting to Congress as an untapped national resource and convinced the government to fund public broadcasting to inform and educate the American public. The Public Broadcasting Act was passed in 1967 and began a fight against subpar, lowbrow entertainment being touted by the network television stations. The FCC called network television a vast wasteland, and the Public Broadcasting Act helped establish the quasi-governmental agency, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which was funded partially by federal dollars and partially by fundraising and gifts. In 1970, National Public Radio hit the scene with All Things Considered, a 90-minute news magazine that worked as an alternative news source, opposite numerous headline services that strayed away from in-depth coverage. Terrestrial radio is going through a transition and will most likely not go away, but is under assault from a lot of angles based on new media formats becoming major players. Sirius and XM satellite radio started out shaky. It was radio that you had to pay for like a cable network. Its draw was over 100 channels with very few commercials, crystal clear sound, no FCC regulation on vulgar speech, and you could tune it in almost anywhere. The regulation on vulgar speech was because it was a service that had to be purchased like cable. So XM signed a deal with Major League Baseball and began covering every game, which was a huge draw for sports fans. The companies were losing money, Sirius and XM, with their new service. And in 2009, they merged into one giant satellite radio company called Sirius XM. And they have over 18 million subscribers and have really pulled a large audience away from terrestrial radio. iPods and MP3 players with services like iTunes have pulled another large audience segment away from radio with customizable playlists, no commercials or DJs to listen to. And then public radio pulls audiences from desirable demographics like educated folks with money away from for-profit stations. Podcasts and TiVo-like on-demand services have also been gaining ground as alternatives to normal for-profit radio stations. So less audiences means less advertising dollars, which means less viable companies. I have a link on the slide here to a 4-minute segment of an All Things Considered program about changes in the music industry and our new media landscape that I thought would be relevant to this chapter on sound media. So you can go ahead and check that out if you would like. That's all I have for you about sound media. Have a great day, and I'll see you in class.